I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
The ancient coaching inn known as the Candlelit Inn stood like a beacon against the December tempest, its mullioned windows casting pools of amber light across the snow-laden courtyard. Built in the reign of Elizabeth I, the establishment had weathered 4 centuries of English winters, but none quite so fierce as this. The wind pressed against the diamond-paned glass with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor, while inside, beeswax candles flickered in their sconces, creating an atmosphere of intimate conspiracy that seemed to draw secrets from the very shadows. Lady Octavia Lethbridge had chosen her guests with the calculated precision of a chess master positioning pieces for an elaborate gambit. At 61, she possessed the kind of commanding presence that could silence a room with a raised eyebrow or encourage confidences with a sympathetic smile. Her invitation to this private dinner had been extended on heavy cream paper bearing her family crest, promising an evening of refinement and, more intriguingly, a revelation that will illuminate certain shadows from our shared past. The storm had arrived with theatrical timing, cutting the telephone lines and rendering the narrow country roads impassable. By 8 o'clock, 12 souls found themselves effectively imprisoned within the inn's warm embrace, a circumstance that would prove far more significant than any could have imagined. Mr. Alaric Montfort commanded attention even in such distinguished company. At 63, the renowned art collector moved through the world with the quiet confidence of a man whose opinion could make or break reputations. His recent acquisition of the legendary Blackbrook chalice had sent ripples through antiquarian circles, and tonight he had promised to unveil this treasure to Lady Octavia's carefully selected audience. The chalice itself sat beneath a cloth of burgundy velvet at the center of the dining table, its presence as palpable as that of an additional guest. Captain Edmund Blackwell, recently returned from service in the Far East, carried himself with military bearing despite the tremor in his left hand, a souvenir, he claimed, of tropical fever. His eyes held the restless quality of a man who had seen too much of the world's darker corners. Mrs. Lydia Gray, a widow whose mourning attire had gradually given way to more fashionable dress, possessed the kind of brittle charm that suggested carefully concealed desperation. Her late husband's debts, whispered about in certain circles, had left her in circumstances far more straitened than her appearance suggested. Dr. Serena Pike represented the new generation of professional women, her medical degree from Edinburgh a source of both pride and social awkwardness. At 32, she had established a successful practice treating the nervous disorders of London's elite, though her own composure seemed as carefully maintained as her patients. Julian Lethbridge, Lady Octavia's nephew and heir, affected the casual elegance of a man born to privilege. Yet his eyes betrayed the anxiety of someone whose inheritance might not be as secure as appearances suggested. The remaining guests formed an equally intriguing constellation. Mr. Felix Dane of Dominion Assurance, whose presence suggested that someone's valuable possessions required professional evaluation. Miss Iris Whitcomb, Lady Octavia's companion secretary, whose quiet efficiency masked a sharp intelligence, and the inn's proprietors, Mr. and Mrs. Basil Fenwick, whose discretion was as legendary as their cuisine. Dinner proceeded with the measured elegance of a well-orchestrated performance. The conversation flowed like fine wine, touching upon art, politics, and the peculiar intimacies that develop among people who believe themselves safely isolated from the outside world. It was during the serving of the roast partridge that Montfort rose, his hand resting possessively on the velvet-draped mystery at the table's center. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention, "Lady Octavia has requested that I share with you tonight something rather special. What lies beneath this cloth has been the subject of considerable speculation in certain circles." With a theatrical flourish that would have done credit to the stage, he whisked away the velvet covering. The Blackbrook chalice stood revealed in all its austere magnificence. crafted of chased silver, its elegant stem supported a bowl adorned with a delicate frieze of intertwining vines. A single bead of lapis lazuli, set into the rim like a watching eye, caught the candlelight and held it. The assembly leaned forward as one, drawn by the artifact's undeniable presence. "A gift to the parish church," Montfort continued. "But first, a year's display here in the inn that was once part of the Blackbrook estate. A homecoming, one might say, before its final rest." The appreciation was immediate and genuine, though each guest's reaction revealed something of their character. Mr. Dane's professional eye assessed the chalice's value with the dispassion of long experience. Julian Lethbridge's applause seemed somehow forced, as if he were performing enthusiasm rather than feeling it. Dr. Pike remained motionless, her gaze fixed not on the chalice but on Montfort himself, as if reading some diagnosis in his expression. It was then that fate, with the dramatic timing that seems to govern such moments, chose to intervene. A particularly vicious gust of wind found some weakness in the inn's ancient defenses, causing the rightmost candelabrum to gutter and fail. For 3 heartbeats, the room existed in that peculiar half-light that transforms familiar faces into masks of shadow and suggestion. In that brief darkness, there came the softest of sounds, a chair creaking, fabric whispering against fabric, the barely audible intake of breath that might have been surprise or satisfaction. When young Hutch, the barman, successfully relit the candles, the scene appeared unchanged. The chalice gleamed undisturbed upon its velvet cloth. The guests maintained their positions around the table. Only Montfort had altered. He sat slumped slightly to one side, his head turned away from Lady Octavia as if he had been overcome by a sudden indisposition. One hand rested against the table's edge. The other lay open in his lap in a gesture oddly reminiscent of supplication. "Mr. Montfort," Lady Octavia's voice carried a note of polite concern. "Are you quite well?" He did not respond. Dr. Pike moved with the swift efficiency of professional training, kneeling beside Montfort's chair and pressing her fingers to the pulse point below his ear. Her frown deepened as she withdrew a handkerchief and dabbed gently at something behind his left ear. When she drew the cloth away, it bore a small stain, no larger than a pearl, but unmistakably crimson. "Please," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute authority, "no one must touch anything. Mr. Montfort is dead." The words fell into the candle-lit room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that reached every corner. Captain Blackwell's military composure cracked visibly. Mrs. Gray's wineglass slipped from nerveless fingers to shatter on the oak floor. Julian Lethbridge's face went through a series of expressions too rapid to catalogue. Dead? Felix Dane's professional instincts asserted themselves. But how? We were all here, all watching. "A wound," Dr. Pike replied, her examination continuing with clinical precision. "Very small, very precise, something narrow and extremely sharp, inserted with considerable skill. Death would have been nearly instantaneous." The implications settled upon the room like a shroud. Someone among them, someone who had shared their meal, their conversation, their apparent camaraderie, was a murderer. The storm that raged beyond the windows had transformed their refuge into a prison, and until it passed, they were trapped with a killer who had struck once and might well strike again. Lady Octavia rose slowly, her composure intact despite the magnitude of the crisis. "Mr. Fenwick," she said, her voice steady as granite, "secure all doors. No one enters or leaves until this matter is resolved." She paused, her gaze moving from face to face, reading each expression with the skill of a lifetime spent navigating society's treacherous waters. "We shall send word to London immediately. There is a gentleman there who possesses a singular gift for unraveling such mysteries. We shall summon Monsieur Hercule Poirot." The name hung in the air like an invocation, carrying with it the promise of justice and the threat of exposure. In the flickering candlelight, surrounded by shadows that seemed to harbor secrets, the guests of the Candlelit Inn settled in to wait for the arrival of the little Belgian detective, who would, with his famous little grey cells, illuminate the darkness that had fallen upon their gathering. The game, as Poirot himself might have said, was afoot. The silence that followed Dr. Pike's pronouncement seemed to stretch into eternity, broken only by the storm's relentless assault upon the ancient timbers. Lady Octavia, however, possessed the rare quality of those born to command in crisis. Without raising her voice, she brought order to chaos with the same authority that had once managed vast estates and unruly house parties. "Mr. Fenwick," she said quietly, "secure every entrance. No one enters or leaves until this matter is resolved." The innkeeper, his face grey with shock, gathered his keys with trembling hands and moved to comply. The heavy bolts scraped shut with finality, emphasizing their sudden transformation from guests to prisoners. Dr. Pike remained beside Montfort's still form, her professional composure a stark contrast to the barely controlled panic rippling through the room. She had covered the body with a linen napkin, but the outline beneath served as a constant reminder of their predicament. "The weapon was something thin and sharp," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "A stiletto, perhaps, or a long hat-pin. The wound is behind the left ear, angled upward with surgical precision. Death would have been instantaneous." The implications settled upon the gathering like a shroud. Someone among them had struck with the skill of an assassin, using those few heartbeats of darkness to commit murder in plain sight of 11 witnesses. But how? Felix Dane's professional instincts asserted themselves as he produced a small notebook. We were all here, all watching. That moment of darkness lasted no more than 3 seconds. Lady Octavia's gaze moved systematically around the room, reading each face with the skill of a lifetime spent navigating society's treacherous waters. Precisely why we must account for ourselves with absolute precision. When the candle guttered, who moved? The question hung in the candlelit air like an accusation. Mrs. Gray, who had retreated to the furthest corner, spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. I confess I started when the light failed. I put out my hand to steady myself against the table. "And you were seated nearest to Mr. Montfort," observed Miss Whitcomb quietly, her usually self-effacing manner sharpened by the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Gray's face flushed crimson. "Yes, but I would never—" "No one suggests you would," Lady Octavia interrupted smoothly. "We seek only facts. Captain Blackwell." The military man's composure had cracked visibly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the room's chill. I did not move. My hand trembled, and I placed it in my pocket to conceal the weakness. Nothing more. Julian Lethbridge attempted his usual languid manner, but his voice pitched too high. I merely listened for the door. I thought perhaps the draft had caught it. God, it sounds foolish now. "It sounds human," Lady Octavia replied, then turned to Dr. Pike. "And you?" I remained exactly as I was. I had been observing Mr. Montfort throughout the evening. He appeared in perfect health. Felix Dane adjusted his spectacles with fingers that were not quite steady. I rose to prevent candle wax from damaging the parquet. One step forward, then I stopped when I heard a chair scrape. The systematic accounting continued, each person's movements catalogued with the precision of a military report. Mr. and Mrs. Fenwick had remained by the sideboard, he with carving knife in hand, until the darkness fell. Miss Whitcomb had held Lady Octavia's wine-glass, motionless throughout the brief interval. As the testimonies concluded, the true horror of their situation crystallized. The camaraderie of the evening had evaporated, replaced by a suffocating atmosphere of suspicion. Every polite smile, every casual remark from moments before now seemed potentially sinister. The broken wine glass on the oak floor glinted malevolently in the candlelight, a tangible reminder that their civilized gathering had shattered as completely as Mrs. Gray's stemware. "We are in an unenviable position," Lady Octavia announced, her voice cutting through the mounting tension. "Until Monsieur Poirot can reach us, we must endeavor to remain calm and cooperative. Each of us is both witness and suspect." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "Dr. Pike, I ask that you remain with Mr. Montfort to preserve the scene. Mr. Fenwick, prepare the morning room for the rest of us. It would be inadvisable to remain here." The suggestion met with unspoken agreement, yet no one moved immediately. It was as if each person feared that any change in position might somehow incriminate them further. The storm outside continued its assault, transforming their refuge into a prison where 12 souls waited with growing dread for the arrival of the little Belgian detective, who alone might unravel the sinister web that now bound them all. The Black Brook chalice still gleamed innocently on the table, its sacred purpose now overshadowed by the profane act committed in its presence. In the flickering candlelight, surrounded by shadows that seemed to harbor secrets, the guests prepared to endure the longest night of their lives. The migration to the morning room proceeded with a hesitant choreography of people suddenly aware that every movement might betray guilt or innocence. Lady Octavia led the procession with her characteristic composure, but even she could not entirely mask the tension that had transformed their elegant gathering into something far more sinister. The ancient floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they filed past the dining room, where Dr. Pike maintained her solitary vigil beside the shrouded figure of Alaric Montfort. The morning room, with its faded chintz and portraits of long-dead squires, offered little comfort despite the fire crackling in the grate. Each guest selected a seat with deliberate calculation, positioning themselves to observe others while avoiding direct confrontation. Mrs. Gray claimed the chair furthest from the group, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders as if it might shield her from suspicion. Captain Blackwell positioned himself near the window, his military bearing intact despite the tremor in his hands that had grown more pronounced since the discovery of the body. "We must approach this situation rationally," Lady Octavia announced, settling into the most commanding chair near the hearth. "One among us has committed murder, and until Monsieur Poirot arrives, we remain in considerable danger. The killer has demonstrated both skill and audacity, striking in full view of witnesses." Felix Dane produced his leather notebook with the efficiency of professional habit. "We should establish a precise timeline," he suggested, his insurance investigator's instincts asserting themselves. "Every detail from the moment the candle guttered until Dr. Pike's examination must be documented." Miss Whitcomb, who had been characteristically quiet, cleared her throat delicately. "I observed something during my return to the dining room," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Black Brook chalice has been moved. Not significantly, but it now sits perhaps 2 inches to the left of its original position, and the velvet cloth shows creases that were not there before." The observation sent a ripple of unease through the room. Julian Lethbridge, who had been affecting his usual air of bored sophistication, suddenly appeared younger and considerably more anxious. But surely that could be explained by vibration when the candle was relit. Hutch mentioned his hand was unsteady. "Perhaps," Miss Whitcomb replied, though her tone suggested she found the explanation inadequate. "However, I also noticed that Mr. Montfort seemed unusually pleased with himself throughout dinner. He made several remarks about old debts coming due and appeared to be studying each of us with particular interest." Mrs. Gray's face paled visibly. "What are you suggesting?" Captain Blackwell's laugh held no humor. "She's suggesting what we're all thinking. Montfort knew something about someone at this table, something worth killing for." The implications settled over the room like a shroud. If Montfort had possessed damaging information about one of his fellow guests, it provided a clear motive for murder. But which secret had proven deadly enough to drive someone to kill with such calculated precision? Dr. Pike entered at that moment, her face grave but determined. "I've completed a more thorough examination," she announced. The weapon was inserted at precisely the correct angle to sever the vertebral artery. Death would have been instantaneous and virtually silent, This required considerable anatomical knowledge. All eyes turned to her with sudden suspicion, and she raised her chin defiantly. Yes, I possess such knowledge, as would anyone with medical training or certain military experience. Her gaze moved meaningfully to Captain Blackwell, who stiffened visibly. The sheer audacity of it, he muttered, taking a long swallow from the brandy Mr. Fenwick had silently provided. To strike so precisely in that brief moment of darkness, either exceptional skill or extraordinary luck. Or both, Dr. Pike replied coldly. What concerns me more is the complete absence of the murder weapon. It was withdrawn as cleanly as it was inserted, suggesting the killer came prepared and remained calm enough to dispose of evidence immediately. The storm outside seemed to echo their inner turmoil, its howling wind a perfect accompaniment to the growing atmosphere of paranoia. Mr. Fenwick confirmed what they all feared. The roads remained impassable, the telephone lines dead, and their isolation complete until dawn at the earliest. In the flickering firelight, surrounded by shadows that seemed to harbor accusation, they settled in to endure the longest night of their lives, knowing that somewhere in the storm, Hercule Poirot was making his way toward them, carrying with him the promise of justice and the threat of exposure that would soon illuminate the darkness that had fallen upon the Candlelit Inn. The long night stretched endlessly before the trapped guests, each hour marked by the relentless ticking of the long case clock and the gradual deterioration of civilized composure. Sleep proved impossible for most. Those who attempted to doze in their chairs found themselves starting awake at every creak of the ancient timbers, every shift of settling snow upon the roof. Mrs. Gray had taken to pacing near the window, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders, while Captain Blackwell sat rigidly upright, his military bearing intact despite the increasing tremor in his hands. Dr. Pike maintained her vigil in the dining room, checking periodically on the shrouded figure of Alaric Montfort, her professional composure a stark contrast to the barely controlled anxiety that permeated the morning room. As the hours wore on, the storm's fury gradually began to abate. The howling wind that had battered the inn throughout the night softened to intermittent gusts, and the first pale fingers of dawn crept across the snow-laden landscape. It was then, just as exhaustion threatened to overcome even the most vigilant among them, that the distant sound of a motor-car engine cut through the diminishing storm. The sound grew steadily stronger, a determined mechanical rhythm that spoke of skillful driving through treacherous conditions. Lady Octavia moved to the frost-etched window, peering through the grey morning light at the approaching vehicle. "A Rolls-Royce," she announced, her voice carrying the first note of genuine relief they had heard since the discovery of the murder. "Monsieur, Poirot has arrived." The transformation in the room was immediate and electric. Relief warred with apprehension as each guest realized that their ordeal was about to enter a new and potentially more perilous phase. The little Belgian detective's reputation preceded him, and every person present understood that his arrival meant their carefully guarded secrets would soon be subjected to the most penetrating scrutiny imaginable. Mr. Fenwick hurried to unlock the heavy oak door, his keys jangling with nervous energy. Moments later, Hercule Poirot stepped across the threshold, and despite the harrowing journey through the storm-ravaged countryside, he appeared remarkably composed. His mustache remained perfectly waxed, his patent leather shoes gleamed beneath the hem of his impeccable overcoat, and his pale green eyes swept the assembled company with the intensity of a jeweler examining precious stones. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, removing his hat with a precise gesture that somehow managed to convey both courtesy and authority. "I regret most profoundly that we meet under such tragic circumstances. The roads, they have conspired most viciously against order and punctuality." He paused to shake a few errant snowflakes from his coat with fastidious care, his gaze never leaving the faces before him. "But Hercule Poirot is here now, and I assure you, the truth will be revealed." Lady Octavia stepped forward with admirable composure, though the strain of the night showed in the fine lines around her eyes. "Monsieur Poirot, We are profoundly grateful for your swift response. The situation is most distressing. Mr. Alaric Montfort has been murdered, killed while we all sat at dinner, and the killer remains among us. Ah, but not unknown to Poirot, the detective replied with quiet confidence, his accent lending a musical quality to his precise English. The murderer, he sits in this very room, n'est-ce pas? But first I must examine the scene of this most audacious crime. Dr. Pike, who had emerged from the dining room at the sound of voices, provided Poirot with a concise medical assessment as he studied the scene with the concentrated attention of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. His examination was methodical and thorough, his small hands moving with surprising dexterity as he noted the precise angle of the wound, the position of the limbs, and the undisturbed state of Montfort's evening wear. "Most illuminating," he murmured, producing a magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. The killer possessed considerable anatomical knowledge and remarkable composure. This is not the work of someone driven by sudden passion, non. This is the calculated act of a person who planned most carefully, indeed. He turned his attention to the Black Brook chalice, studying its position on the table with the same meticulous care. Miss Whitcomb's observation about its subtle displacement had been accurate. The artifact had indeed been moved, though so delicately that only the most observant eye would have detected the change. "Tell me, Monsieur Fenwick," Poirot said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of casual inquiry that somehow managed to sound deeply significant. "In your kitchen you possess the implements necessary for the preparation of fowl, the larding needles, the trussing pins." The innkeeper's face went pale as understanding dawned. "Yes, monsieur. We used them for the partridges last evening. I instructed young Hutch to return them to their proper place." "Kindly verify their presence," Poirot requested with polite firmness. Fenwick disappeared into the kitchen, and the silence that followed stretched taut as a violin string. When he returned, his expression confirmed their worst fears. "The larding needle is missing, sir. A thin steel implement, perhaps 6 inches in length, with a sharp point designed for threading fat through lean meat." A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled guests. The murder weapon had been identified, and its domestic origin suggested that the killer had not come prepared for violence, but had seized upon an opportunity presented by the evening's circumstances. Poirot raised one small, perfectly manicured hand, and the room fell silent. "We do not leap to conclusions," he said gently but firmly. "We proceed with method and order. The little gray cells, they require facts, not assumptions." His gaze moved systematically from face to face, cataloging expressions and reactions with the precision of a scientist recording data. "Now then," he continued, settling into the chair Lady Octavia had vacated for his use, "Hercule Poirot will hear your individual accounts of those crucial moments when darkness fell upon your gathering. Each of you will tell me not merely what you saw, but what you felt, what you heard, what your instincts whispered in that brief interval when evil struck. And please," his voice carried a note of gentle warning, "do not attempt to deceive Poirot. The little grey cells are most efficient at detecting the smallest falsehood." The morning light, filtering through the frost-etched windows, seemed to illuminate not just the room, but the gravity of their situation. Somewhere among these respectable, civilized people sat a killer who had struck with surgical precision and inhuman calm. The game of cat and mouse between hunter and hunted was about to begin in earnest. Poirot's approach to the individual interviews demonstrated the methodical precision that had made his reputation legendary throughout Europe. Rather than conducting the interrogations in the comfortable morning room, he insisted upon returning to the dining room, positioning himself in the very chair where Alaric Montfort had met his end. The psychological effect was immediate and unmistakable. Each suspect who entered found themselves confronting not merely questions, but the stark reality of murder committed in their midst. "The scene of the crime, it speaks to us," Poirot explained to Lady Octavia as she took her seat across from him. Here, where the deed was done, the memory is most sharp, the emotions most true. His pale green eyes studied her with the intensity of a jeweler examining a precious stone for flaws. You organized this gathering, madame. Tell me, what was your true purpose in bringing these particular people together? Lady Octavia maintained her composure admirably, though a slight tremor in her hands betrayed the strain of the night's events. Monsieur Montfort requested specific guests for his unveiling of the Black Brook chalice. He spoke of settling old accounts, of bringing certain matters to their proper conclusion. She paused, her gaze drifting to the shrouded form that had been removed to an adjacent chamber. Alaric was a collector, Monsieur Poirot, but not merely of artifacts. He collected information, secrets, the small indiscretions that people prefer to keep buried. This revelation cast the evening's events in an entirely new light. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying gentle but inexorable authority. You suspected his intentions were not entirely honorable. I feared them, she admitted quietly. But I could hardly refuse his request without appearing churlish. The Black Brook chalice was, after all, returning to its ancestral home. Mrs. Lydia Gray entered next, her fragile composure barely intact after the harrowing night. She clutched a damp handkerchief in trembling hands, her eyes darting nervously around the room as if expecting Montfort's ghost to materialize from the shadows. Madame Gray, Poirot began with characteristic gentleness, you were seated immediately to Monsieur Montfort's left. During the evening, did he speak to you of personal matters? The widow's face crumpled with barely suppressed anguish. He knew about my circumstances, Monsieur Poirot. My late husband left considerable debts, and I have been forced to sell family heirlooms to maintain appearances. Montfort dealt in such pieces, and he recognized several items I had been obliged to dispose of through less than reputable channels. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He threatened to expose my financial difficulties unless I provided him with information about other guests' private affairs. He called it mutual assistance. And when the candle guttered, madame, I started violently. The sudden darkness terrified me. I cannot bear it since my widowhood. My hand flew out to steady myself against the table. I may have brushed against Mr. Montfort's shoulder, but I swear by all that is holy, I did nothing more. Captain Blackwell's interview revealed the military man's barely controlled fury beneath his disciplined exterior. His account was delivered with clipped precision, but his hands shook so violently that he required both to steady his brandy glass. Montfort possessed information about my medical discharge, he admitted through gritted teeth. A fever contracted in Burma left me unfit for command, but there were other circumstances. A fellow officer's death under questionable conditions. Montfort had somehow acquired the confidential reports and threatened to make them public unless I assisted him in acquiring certain military artifacts from estate sales. The larding needle, Captain. As a military man, you would be familiar with such implements. Blackwell's jaw tightened. Any soldier knows how to use edged weapons, Monsieur Poirot. But I placed my trembling hand in my pocket during those crucial moments and did not move from my chair. Dr. Pike's professional composure remained intact, but her revelations added another disturbing layer to Montfort's character. He had made extensive inquiries about my practice, particularly my treatment of nervous disorders and my access to pharmaceutical supplies. His questions grew increasingly specific and uncomfortable, suggesting knowledge of my professional methods that went beyond casual interest. He was blackmailing you as well, mademoiselle. Attempting to, she replied coldly. He possessed no actual evidence of wrongdoing, but in my profession, even unfounded suspicions can destroy a career. He wanted me to provide him with confidential information about my patient's conditions, information he could use for his own purposes. Julian Lethbridge's testimony proved most illuminating of all. Lady Octavia's nephew had abandoned his usual languid affectation, his anxiety now plainly visible as he fidgeted with his watch chain. Montfort had been investigating my activities in London, he confessed reluctantly. gaming debts, associations with persons of questionable reputation, certain financial arrangements that, while not criminal, would certainly damage my prospects with my aunt. He possessed documentation that could have persuaded her to alter her will entirely. And you were desperate to prevent such exposure? Julian's face went pale. Desperate enough to consider drastic measures, yes. But murder? In front of 11 witnesses? Surely you cannot believe me capable of such audacity. As the interviews progressed, a clear pattern emerged. Montfort had systematically gathered compromising information about each guest, using their secrets as leverage for his own purposes. The man had been a blackmailer of the most sophisticated sort, wielding knowledge like a weapon and taking evident pleasure in others' discomfort. Felix Dane's professional assessment added the final piece to the puzzle of motive. Montfort had requested a comprehensive evaluation of the Blackbrook chalice for insurance purposes. My preliminary examination revealed certain irregularities in its provenance, subtle inconsistencies that suggested possible forgery or unauthorized restoration. I had not yet shared these concerns, but Montfort seemed anxious about my findings. Miss Whitcomb's quiet revelation proved most chilling of all. He kept detailed files on everyone. Monsieur Poirot, a leather portfolio that he carried everywhere, containing what he called his insurance policies. He spoke of human weakness as being more valuable than any artifact in his collection. Poirot sat in contemplative silence as the final interview concluded, his small hands steepled before him. The morning light streaming through the mullioned windows illuminated not just the room, but the full scope of the crime that had been committed. This had not been a murder born of sudden passion, but a calculated execution performed by someone who possessed both the anatomical knowledge to strike with surgical precision and the nerve to act in full view of 11 witnesses. The psychology, it is most fascinating, he murmured, his gaze moving slowly around the room where each suspect had revealed their secrets and fears. We have here not merely a murder, but a liberation. Someone among you decided that Monsieur Montfort's reign of terror must end, and they possessed both the skill and the opportunity to ensure it did. He rose from his chair with characteristic precision, smoothing his waistcoat with meticulous care. But perfection, mes amis, it is an illusion. The killer has been most clever, most audacious, but there is always a flaw, always one small detail that betrays the truth. And Hercule Poirot, he will find it. The promise hung in the air like a sword of Damocles, and each person present understood that their carefully constructed facades were about to be subjected to the most penetrating scrutiny imaginable. The game of deception had entered its most dangerous phase, and somewhere among them sat a killer who had struck with inhuman calm and surgical precision, believing themselves safe behind a mask of civilized respectability. Poirot's next move demonstrated the methodical precision that had made his reputation legendary throughout Europe. Rather than accepting the testimonies at face value, he insisted upon a practical reconstruction of the crucial moments when murder had been committed under the noses of 11 witnesses. "We shall recreate the scene exactly as it was," he announced, positioning each person in their original seat around the dining table. The morning light streaming through the mullioned windows seemed inadequate for his purposes, so he instructed Mr. Fenwick to draw the heavy curtains and relight the candles precisely as they had been arranged the previous evening. The Blackbrook chalice was returned to its position at the table's center, though its presence now seemed more ominous than ceremonial. "Monsieur Hutch," Poirot addressed the young barman with characteristic courtesy, "you will recreate the moment when the candle guttered. Everyone else will remain absolutely still and observe not merely what they see, but what they feel, what their instincts whisper in those crucial seconds." The recreation proved illuminating in ways none had anticipated. When the rightmost candelabrum was deliberately extinguished, the familiar half-light bloomed in the room like an unwelcome memory. In that brief interval of semi-darkness, every subtle movement became magnified, every breath audible, every shift of fabric a potential betrayal of guilt. 3 seconds, Poirot murmured as the candle was relit. In 3 seconds, a life was taken with surgical precision. The killer possessed not merely anatomical knowledge, but remarkable composure under pressure. His pale green eyes moved systematically around the table, cataloguing each person's position and capabilities. The wound was delivered from the left side, requiring either a left-handed assailant or someone positioned behind Monsieur Montfort. But behind was impossible without disturbing other guests. Miss Whitcomb, who had observed the reconstruction with particular intensity, cleared her throat delicately. "Monsieur Poirot, there is something I must confess. During the evening, I noticed that Mr. Montfort carried a small leather attaché case, which he called his memory box. He claimed it contained his most valuable possessions, more precious than any artifact in his collection. That case has disappeared." The revelation sent a ripple of fresh anxiety through the assembled guests. If Montfort's blackmail materials had vanished along with his life, it suggested the killer had been motivated not merely by revenge, but by the practical necessity of destroying evidence. "Most illuminating," Poirot replied, producing his magnifying glass to examine the table's surface. "But first, we must search systematically for what the killer may have discarded in haste." His methodical examination of the dining room yielded nothing, but when the search expanded to adjacent chambers, young Hutch made a discovery that sent shock waves through the group. In the morning room's coal scuttle, buried beneath a layer of ash, lay the remnants of a leather portfolio. The fire had consumed most of its contents, but enough survived to reveal Montfort's systematic documentation of his guests' secrets. Charred fragments bore partial names and tantalizing glimpses of compromising information, but one section had been deliberately cut away before the burning. "The killer took what they needed and destroyed the rest," Dr. Pike observed clinically, a methodical approach that suggests considerable forethought. "Indeed," Poirot agreed, but his attention had shifted to something else entirely. "Monsieur Fenwick, I require a thorough search of all outer garments. The killer may have retained evidence inadvertently." The systematic examination of coats and cloaks hanging in the entrance hall proceeded with tense efficiency. It was in the lining of Captain Blackwell's military greatcoat that the most damning evidence emerged. A small puncture in the fabric, accompanied by traces of blood and what appeared to be animal fat from the evening's meal preparation. The discovery sent the room into barely controlled chaos. Mrs. Gray gasped audibly, while Julian Lethbridge's face brightened with unmistakable relief. Felix Danes snapped his notebook shut with professional satisfaction, clearly believing the case solved. "Motive, means, and opportunity," he declared with the confidence of an experienced investigator. "The evidence is quite conclusive." But Poirot's expression suggested profound skepticism rather than satisfaction. His pale green eyes studied not the incriminating evidence, but the faces of those who seemed most relieved by its discovery. "Conclusive, you say?" he murmured, his accent lending musical authority to his words. "But convenience, mes amis, it is often the enemy of truth. The psychology does not sing harmoniously with this neat solution." The little detective's calm cut through the sudden excitement like a scalpel. Captain Blackwell sat rigidly upright, his military bearing intact despite the damning evidence, while somewhere in the room the true killer maintained their facade of civilized respectability, perhaps believing they had successfully misdirected suspicion toward an innocent man. The game of deception had entered its most dangerous phase, and Poirot's skeptical gaze suggested that the obvious solution was merely another layer of the elaborate psychological puzzle he had been summoned to solve. Captain Blackwell's composure finally cracked under the weight of seemingly conclusive evidence, his hands trembling so violently that he could barely maintain his grip on the brandy glass. The military bearing that had sustained him through years of hostile service proved insufficient against the accusatory stares of his fellow guests. Yet Poirot's pale green eyes held not satisfaction, but profound skepticism. "This evidence, it declares itself too loudly," the little detective murmured, his accent lending musical authority to his words. "Convenience, mes amis, it is often the enemy of truth. A seasoned military man would not carry the murder weapon in his coat like a calling card, waiting to be discovered." He approached Captain Blackwell with characteristic precision. "Your tremor, mon ami, it affects only the left hand, while the right remains perfectly steady. Most curious for a systemic neurological condition, non?" Dr. Pike straightened with professional interest. "Monsieur Poirot raises an excellent point. Tropical fevers that cause tremor typically affect both sides equally. A unilateral tremor suggests localized nerve damage rather than systemic disease." The captain's face went ashen, but his military training asserted itself. "You're quite right, Doctor. The tremor results from a specific wound sustained in Burma. The official report attributed my discharge to fever because the true circumstances would have reflected poorly on my commanding officer. Montfort had acquired the actual medical records and threatened exposure." "Précisément," Poirot replied, but his attention had already shifted to more pressing concerns. "And yet, mon capitaine, observe your own hands. The left trembles, but could it have guided a larding needle with surgical precision in 3 seconds of darkness? I think not." He turned to address the room with gentle authority. "The blood upon the coat, the convenient puncture in the fabric, these are the work of someone who wishes to implicate the captain rather than conceal their own guilt." Mrs. Gray's voice carried barely controlled hysteria. "But surely the evidence speaks for itself. We can contact the authorities and end this nightmare." "Patience, madame. Truth requires careful cultivation." Poirot's gaze moved systematically around the room, cataloguing reactions with scientific precision. The psychology does not harmonize with such a neat solution. No, our killer is far more sophisticated than this crude attempt at misdirection suggests. His attention returned to the dining table, specifically to the black brook chalice that sat beneath its burgundy cloth. "Monsieur Dane, you mentioned irregularities in the chalice's provenance. During your examination, what precisely troubled you?" Felix Dane adjusted his spectacles nervously. "The craftsmanship is superb, but certain details seemed inconsistent with authentic Blackbrook period work. The silver showed subtle deviations from known techniques, and the lapis lazuli, while exquisite, appeared somewhat newer than one would expect for an artifact of this supposed antiquity. I had expressed preliminary concerns to Montfort, and he seemed most agitated by my findings. Agitated, or perhaps concerned that his grand unveiling would expose a very different kind of secret." Poirot approached the chalice with renewed interest, his small hands hovering over the delicate silver. He lifted it carefully, turning it slowly beneath his magnifying glass, tracing the intricate frieze of intertwining vines with scientific precision. The room watched in tense silence as Poirot's examination grew more focused. His finger ran along the rim, then pressed lightly against the base of the single lapis lazuli bead. There was a faint click, barely audible above the storm's diminishing fury outside. A small section of the rim, directly beneath the gem, slid inward with mechanical precision, revealing a minuscule cavity. From within this hidden compartment, Poirot carefully extracted a tightly folded piece of parchment, aged and brittle, covered in faded but elegant script. Lady Octavia's hand flew to her mouth. "Mon Dieu." Poirot unfolded the parchment with infinite care, his pale green eyes scanning the contents with growing excitement. It was not an ancient document, but a meticulously drawn diagram accompanied by precise measurements and detailed instructions. The drawing depicted the inner workings of a complex spring-loaded mechanism designed to be concealed within a larger artifact. "This is not a diagram of the chalice itself," Dr. Pike observed, her scientific mind grasping the implications immediately. "It appears to be a blueprint for a concealment device that could be inserted into an existing piece." "Précisément, mademoiselle. Poirot affirmed, his voice carrying intellectual satisfaction. "And observe the handwriting. It matches the elegant script we glimpsed in the charred fragments of Montfort's portfolio. This is not a record of blackmail, mes amis. This is evidence of a far more sophisticated crime, art fraud on a grand scale." The revelation struck the room like a thunderbolt. Julian Lethbridge's face went pale, while Mrs. Gray sank deeper into her chair. Felix Dane's professional composure cracked visibly as he realized the implications for his own involvement. "The Blackbrook chalice," Poirot continued with quiet authority, "was Montfort's masterpiece of deception. Not merely a forgery, but the centerpiece of an elaborate scheme involving authentication, insurance fraud, and the systematic replacement of genuine artifacts with sophisticated copies. The murder was committed not to silence a blackmailer, but to protect a criminal enterprise worth far more than mere secrets." The larding needle in Captain Blackwell's coat now appeared exactly what Poirot had suspected, a crude diversion designed to draw attention from the true motive. The killer had struck not from personal vengeance, but to prevent the collapse of a carefully constructed network of fraud that could implicate multiple conspirators. As the morning light strengthened beyond the frost-etched windows, the true scope of the crime began to emerge. Somewhere in the room sat not merely a murderer, but the orchestrator of an elaborate deception that had cost Alaric Montfort his life and threatened to destroy anyone else who stood in its way. The game had elevated far beyond simple blackmail to something infinitely more dangerous and complex. Poirot's pale green eyes moved systematically from face to face, reading the subtle signs of guilt and fear that no amount of civilized composure could entirely conceal. The little gray cells were working with mechanical precision, and soon the truth would emerge from the shadows that had protected it through the long, dark night at the Candlelit Inn. The revelation of the art fraud scheme had transformed the investigation entirely, but Poirot did not allow the discovery to dissipate into speculative chatter. Instead, he moved with characteristic precision, his pale green eyes studying each face with renewed intensity as the psychological landscape shifted beneath their feet. "The chalice, it must be secured immediately," he announced with quiet authority. "Lady Octavia, you possess a safe in your chambers, no? We shall place it there under careful watch, for I suspect our killer is not finished with their work." His request carried the weight of absolute certainty, and Lady Octavia nodded, leading the way to her sitting room where a small wall safe sat concealed behind a pastoral, painting. As Mr. Fenwick produced the key and the Blackbrook chalice was carefully wrapped in its burgundy velvet, Poirot arranged the watch with deliberate calculation. "Miss Whitcomb and Monsieur Dane shall take the first hour," he declared, positioning 2 chairs in the corridor outside. "Then Captain Blackwell and Madame Gray, with Dr. Pike available for any emergency. Monsieur Julien, you shall take the final watch with Lady Octavia herself." The arrangements appeared purely practical, but Poirot's psychological gambit ran far deeper. Before withdrawing, he spoke just loudly enough for all to hear, his voice carrying casual authority. "Somewhere within the chalice, I have reason to believe, lies a second document of even greater significance than the diagram we have discovered. Perhaps it contains the complete record of substitutions, the names of accomplices, the full scope of this criminal enterprise." The effect was immediate and telling. Felix Dane's professional composure flickered with barely concealed calculation. Miss Whitcomb drew a sharp, startled breath. Julian Lethbridge's face showed hunted alarm, while Mrs. Gray clutched her shawl with renewed desperation. Only Dr. Pike remained outwardly unmoved, though the slight narrowing of her eyes suggested she recognized the dangerous nature of Poirot's strategy. As the first hour of the watch commenced, Poirot occupied himself in the morning room with apparent abstraction, rearranging the place cards from the dinner table into curious patterns as if coaxing secrets from cardboard. When Mr. Fenwick entered to inquire about additional coal, Poirot's questions seemed casual, but were anything but random. Which guest had arrived earliest? Who had handled the chalice before its placement? The answers settled into his mind like numbered counters on a board. The interruption, when it came, announced itself with the unmistakable acrid smell of smoke threading down the staircase. Miss Whitcomb's voice, sharp with alarm, echoed from above. "Fire! There's a fire in Lady Octavia's sitting room." The corridor erupted in controlled chaos as Mr. Fenwick and Captain Blackwell bounded up the stairs, the former bearing a heavy woolen rug, the latter ripping a curtain from its rings with military efficiency. In the doorway of the sitting room, a wastebasket blazed with greedy flames that had already begun to lick at the damask drapes. The fire was quickly smothered, but young Hutch, who had rushed up behind them, suddenly crumpled at the threshold as if struck by an invisible hand. Dr. Pike's examination was swift and professional. A blow to the temple, not severe but deliberate. Someone struck him from behind and fled. Her clinical assessment carried ominous implications, for in the room itself, the wall safe stood ajar like a gaping mouth. The velvet bundle on the chaise, when unwrapped with trembling hands, revealed not the Black Brook chalice, but a pewter tankard of rustic manufacture, swaddled in burgundy cloth. "Removed earlier," Poirot observed with quiet satisfaction, brushing a smear of soot from his sleeve with fastidious care. "I anticipated that the bait might prove irresistible to someone whose desperation had overcome their caution." His pale green eyes moved systematically around the group, noting who had arrived first at the scene, who had come last, and most significantly, who was conspicuously absent. It was then that Julian Lethbridge appeared, flushed and breathless, his usually perfect hair disordered in a manner that seemed almost theatrical. His stammered explanation about fetching water from the scullery and being delayed by stuck door met with Poirot's polite but skeptical silence. The little detective's examination of the scene yielded several crucial observations. The wastebasket had contained thin onion-skin paper torn in long strips, suggesting a ledger rather than casual correspondence. Miss Whitcomb's left cuff bore a telltale smudge of soot where ash had brushed against linen. Most significantly, the safe's ancient mechanism required a specific technique: upward pressure on the handle while turning the key, knowledge that came only from repeated use. As young Hutch was revived with Dr. Pike's smelling salts, his confused testimony added another piece to the puzzle. He had glimpsed a figure moving low and quick along the corridor, face turned away, pausing at Lady Octavia's door with an odd hitch of the shoulder before slipping inside. The detail was small, but significant to Poirot's methodical mind. Back in the morning room, where the air was clearer and tensions ran high, Poirot set the pewter decoy upon the table with meticulous care. Beside it, he placed a cloth retrieved from the corridor, upon which a faint grey track marked where hasty hands had lifted the substitute in darkness and disappointment. "The psychology becomes most illuminating," he announced, his accent lending musical authority to his words. This was not the desperate act of a blackmail victim seeking freedom, mes amis. This was the calculated response of a professional protecting a criminal enterprise. Someone who expected to find the genuine chalice. Someone who feared that a second document might expose their complicity. Someone willing to employ fire and violence to create the necessary confusion. Felix Dane, who had been growing increasingly agitated, suddenly blurted out words that betrayed far more than he intended. If there were another compartment, it would require a ratchet mechanism under the bead to reset the spring properly. The technical knowledge, offered unbidden, hung in the air like an accusation. No one had mentioned any ratchet mechanism, yet Dane spoke with the authority of intimate familiarity. "Merci, monsieur," Poirot replied with gentle courtesy, his pale green eyes fixed upon the insurance investigator with renewed interest. "You fascinate me exceedingly." The morning light streaming through the frost-etched windows seemed to illuminate not just the room, but the full scope of the criminal conspiracy that had culminated in murder. The killer had revealed themselves through desperation, through technical knowledge they should not have possessed, through actions that spoke of professional expertise rather than personal vengeance. Poirot's little grey cells had processed every detail, every reaction, every telling slip of the tongue. The truth was crystallizing with mathematical precision, and soon he would gather them all for the final revelation that would expose not merely a murderer, but the architect of an elaborate fraud who had killed to protect their carefully constructed criminal empire. The game of psychological chess between hunter and hunted had reached its penultimate move, and Poirot's expression carried the quiet satisfaction of a master who had maneuvered his opponent into an inescapable position. The shadows that had protected the guilty through the long night at the Candlelit Inn were about to be banished by the cold, clear light of irrefutable truth. The technical knowledge that Felix Dane had inadvertently revealed hung in the air like an accusation. But Poirot did not press his advantage immediately. Instead, he moved with characteristic precision, his pale green eyes studying the insurance investigator with the concentrated attention of a scientist observing a particularly fascinating specimen. The little detective understood that premature confrontation often drove the guilty to desperate measures, while methodical pressure allowed the truth to emerge with mathematical inevitability. The little grey cells, they require systematic verification, Poirot announced with deceptive mildness, producing his pocket watch and consulting it with fastidious care. "We shall conduct a small experiment, if you please. Each person will demonstrate precisely what movements were possible during those crucial 3 seconds of darkness." The reconstruction proved illuminating in ways none had anticipated. When young Hutch dimmed the rightmost candles to reproduce the exact penumbra of the previous evening, Poirot requested that each guest, without rising from their original position, extend their hand toward where Montfort's neck had been. The exercise revealed the stark geography of opportunity with uncomfortable clarity. Mrs. Gray's trembling hand, when the dimness fell, could reach the precise location with startling accuracy, but her obvious terror and lack of anatomical knowledge made her an unlikely candidate for such surgical precision. Dr. Pike's reach required an awkward lean across crystal and silverware that would have created audible disturbance in the hushed room. Julian Lethbridge's position rendered a direct strike nearly impossible without obvious movement. Only Felix Dane, seated at the optimal angle with professional knowledge of anatomy inherited from his physician father, possessed both opportunity and expertise. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured as the candlelight steadied, but his attention had shifted to something far more subtle. Throughout the morning, he had observed Dane's unconscious habit of favoring his left shoulder, a slight hitch that preceded any extended movement of his right arm. When young Hutch had described the fleeing figure's peculiar gait, a sort of slip along the skirting with a jerk of the left shoulder, the detail had seemed insignificant. Now it formed part of a damning pattern. Poirot's methodical examination of the inn's lower floors yielded additional evidence that transformed suspicion into near certainty. In Montfort's chamber, a rectangular shadow on the escritoire's leather surface marked where the missing attaché case had rested. More significantly, a tiny fragment of onion skin paper clung to a splinter near the wardrobe lock, bearing the partial heading "Schedule of Replacements, D," in neat copperplate script. The initial, ending abruptly in the tear, suggested systematic documentation of fraudulent substitutions organized alphabetically by accomplice. The search for the murder weapon required more delicate handling. Poirot's pale green eyes moved systematically through the inn's common areas, noting every possible hiding place with the thoroughness of a man who understood that desperate killers often chose concealment over disposal. His attention eventually focused on the umbrella stand beneath the entrance hall coats, where a thin length of card had been folded around something rigid and metallic. The larding needle, when revealed, bore unmistakable evidence of its deadly purpose. A minute smear of dried blood marked its shaft, while a wisp of chintz thread clung near the eye where it had brushed against Montfort's chair, back during the fatal strike. The weapon's hiding place spoke of hasty concealment rather than calculated disposal, the action of someone whose professional composure had been shattered by the enormity of their crime. "The psychology becomes most clear," Poirot observed, setting the needle upon the mantel with ceremonial precision. "This placement, it is neither cunning nor secure. It speaks of a mind accustomed to systematic planning suddenly forced to improvise under extreme pressure." Felix Dane's face had grown progressively paler throughout the evidence presentation, his professional composure cracking like ice under spring pressure. When Poirot produced the onion skin fragment with its damning partial heading, Dane's involuntary intake of breath was audible throughout the room. "The D could refer to anyone," he stammered, but his voice pitched higher than usual, betraying the desperation beneath his attempted nonchalance. "Surely you cannot construct an entire case upon a single letter and some unfortunate coincidences." "Coincidences, Monsieur Dane." Poirot's voice carried gentle reproach. "Your arrival at the inn hours before the other guests, requesting private access to examine the chalice's packaging. Your intimate knowledge of concealment mechanisms that were never described in our investigation. Your unconscious physical mannerisms that match young Hutch's description of the fleeing figure. These are not coincidences, mon ami. These are the threads of a pattern that the little gray cells find most compelling." The insurance investigator's hands trembled as he reached for his brandy glass, the professional steadiness that had served him throughout his career finally abandoning him when he needed it most. His eyes darted around the room, seeking escape routes or sympathetic faces, finding neither. The civilized gathering that had begun with such promise the previous evening had transformed into a tribunal where his guilt was being methodically established through irrefutable evidence. "I have made arrangements," Poirot continued with quiet authority, "to wire London immediately when the telephone lines are restored. There is a gentleman at the British Museum who possesses an extraordinary ability to identify technical draftsmanship. He will examine the blueprint we discovered and determine whether it was drawn by someone trained in actuarial precision rather than artistic expression." The threat hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. Dane understood that his specialized training in insurance documentation would be as distinctive as a signature to an expert examiner. The net that had been closing around him throughout the morning was now drawn so tight that only confession or desperate flight remained as options. As the winter light strengthened beyond the frost-etched windows, the long night at the Candlelit Inn was approaching its inevitable conclusion. The shadows that had protected the guilty through the darkest hours were being systematically banished by the cold, clear illumination of methodical investigation. Poirot's little gray cells had processed every detail, every reaction, every telling slip of tongue and gesture, constructing an edifice of evidence that would soon collapse upon the head of Alaric Montfort's killer. The game of psychological chess between hunter and hunted had reached its penultimate move, and Felix Dane's increasingly desperate demeanor suggested that checkmate was merely a matter of time. The truth, like the morning sun, was rising inexorably to illuminate the full scope of the crime that had transformed their elegant gathering into a deadly trap of secrets, lies, and ultimately, murder. The winter morning had transformed the Candlelit Inn into something resembling a courtroom, with pale sunlight streaming through the frost-etched windows to illuminate what would prove to be the final act of that deadly drama. Poirot had arranged the chairs in a precise semicircle facing the mantelpiece, where the larding needle rested beside the pewter decoy, like exhibits in a trial. His pale green eyes moved systematically from face to face, reading the subtle signs of guilt and innocence that no amount of civilized composure could entirely conceal. "Mesdames et messieurs, he began, his voice carrying the musical authority that had made his reputation legendary. "We have endured a most distressing night, but the little gray cells have worked with their customary precision. The truth, she emerges from the shadows like the morning sun, and what she illuminates is not merely murder, but a criminal enterprise of remarkable sophistication." Felix Dane shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his professional composure beginning to crack like ice under spring pressure. The insurance investigator's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his brandy glass, the steady fingers that had signed countless fraudulent authentications now betraying the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. "We began with what appeared to be a crime of passion," Poirot continued, his methodical explanation unfolding with mathematical precision. "A blackmailer silenced by one of his victims during a moment of darkness, but the little grey cells, they whispered warnings about this convenient solution. The wound was too precise, the timing too perfect, the motive too obvious. He moved to Captain Blackwell, who straightened with military bearing despite his obvious relief. Mon Capitaine, you provided an excellent tableau of guilt. The blood upon your coat, the puncture in the fabric, the tremor that suggested nervous collapse under pressure. But your left-handed weakness makes the surgical precision impossible, and your military training would never permit such crude evidence to remain upon your person." Dr. Pike nodded with professional understanding as Poirot continued his systematic elimination. "Mademoiselle, you possess both anatomical knowledge and steady hands, but your position at table required an awkward lean that would have disturbed crystal and silverware. Moreover, your immediate medical assessment was too precise, too clinical. The guilty party, they avoid creating such exact timelines." Mrs. Gray clutched her shawl tighter as Poirot's gentle gaze fell upon her. "Madame, your reach was adequate, but the method required knowledge and composure far beyond what desperation could provide. Fear makes clumsy hands, not a surgeon's precision." Julian Lethbridge's face showed visible relief as Poirot dismissed him with similar logic. "Monsieur Julian, the geometry condemns you not at all. From your position, no clear path existed to deliver such a wound without obvious movement that would have been observed by all." The systematic elimination complete, Poirot returned to the head of the room, his attention focusing entirely upon Felix Dane. "But there is one among us whose opportunity, knowledge, and psychology align with mathematical precision. You arrived early, Monsieur Dane, requesting private access to examine the chalice's packing. You gained quiet entrance to kitchen and pantry under pretext of professional diligence, familiarizing yourself with the domestic implements available." Dane's face had grown progressively paler, but he maintained his defensive posture. "Circumstantial observations, Monsieur Poirot. Nothing that constitutes actual proof." "Ah, but the details. They accumulate like compound interest," Poirot replied with gentle authority. "During the cocktail hour, Dr. Pike observed you standing directly behind Monsieur Montfort's chair, your hand resting briefly upon his shoulder. She assumed it was appreciation for the chalice, but you were measuring, no? Calculating the precise location of the carotid artery, the exact angle required for instantaneous death." The revelation struck the room like lightning, and Dr. Pike's sharp intake of breath confirmed Poirot's deduction. "That's exactly what I observed," she said quietly. "The positioning, the brief contact. It seemed innocent at the time." "Your technical knowledge betrayed you most completely," Poirot continued, his voice gaining strength. "When you spoke unbidden of the ratchet mechanism required to reset the spring, you revealed intimate familiarity with concealment devices that no innocent person could possess. The blueprint we discovered was drawn with actuarial precision, not artistic expression, the work of someone trained in insurance documentation rather than craftsmanship." Felix Dane's composure was cracking visibly now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the room's chill. His left shoulder exhibited the telltale hitch that young Hutch had described in The Fleeing Figure, an unconscious mannerism that became more pronounced under stress. The murder itself was planned with professional precision, Poirot observed, his pale green eyes never leaving Dane's face. "You positioned yourself optimally at dinner, knowing that those crucial 3 seconds of darkness would provide the perfect opportunity. Your left-handed strike delivered the larding needle with surgical accuracy, guided by your earlier anatomical reconnaissance." The psychological pressure was mounting inexorably, and Dane's breathing had become shallow and rapid. The planted evidence upon Captain Blackwell's coat revealed your insurance background, Poirot continued relentlessly. Only someone familiar with fraud investigation would think to prepare animal blood and fat as misdirection, creating false evidence with such methodical precision. Miss Whitcomb's quiet sob drew attention to her corner, where she sat with tears streaming down her face. "I helped him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He said Lady Octavia needed the safe opened urgently, and I knew the mechanism. When the chalice proved to be a decoy, he became desperate, and I started the fire to create confusion." The admission seemed to break the final thread of Dane's resistance. His shoulders sagged with defeat, the professional mask finally slipping to reveal the desperate criminal beneath. "Montfort was going to destroy everything," he said quietly, his voice carrying the hollow ring of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. Years of meticulous planning, an entire network of authentication and replacement, all threatened by his growing recklessness. The confession poured forth with the desperate relief of a dam finally bursting. Dane described the elaborate fraud network, the systematic replacement of genuine artifacts with Montfort's masterful forgeries, the corruption of auction houses and private dealers that had made their scheme possible. The Blackbrook chalice had been intended as their masterpiece, a forgery so perfect that it would cement their reputation while the genuine article disappeared into private collection. But Montfort grew careless with his blackmail schemes, Dane continued, his voice gaining strength as the truth emerged. He threatened to expose our client's other indiscretions, and I knew it was only a matter of time before someone traced the connections back to our professional relationship. He had to be silenced before he destroyed us all. The murder had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized their fraudulent enterprise. The larding needle was perfect, thin enough for surgical precision, common enough to suggest opportunity rather than premeditation. The planted evidence on Captain Blackwell had been prepared as insurance, ready to misdirect suspicion toward the most obvious candidate. As the morning light strengthened beyond the frost-etched windows, Felix Dane sat in defeated silence, his confession complete and his guilt established beyond doubt. Captain Blackwell and Mr. Fenwick positioned themselves to prevent any attempt at flight, while Lady Octavia maintained her composure with admirable dignity despite the violation of hospitality that had occurred under her roof. Poirot's pale green eyes held not triumph, but profound sadness as he contemplated the human cost of greed and deception. "The little grey cells have solved another puzzle," he said quietly. "But the solution brings no joy, only the melancholy satisfaction of truth revealed and justice served. When the telephone lines are restored, we shall summon the authorities from Exeter. Until then, Monsieur Dane will remain here, under the watchful eyes of those whose trust he has so grievously betrayed." The long night at the Candlelit Inn was approaching its inevitable conclusion, with the shadows that had protected the guilty through the darkest hours finally banished by the cold, clear light of methodical investigation and irrefutable truth. The winter morning had transformed the Candlelit Inn into something approaching a courtroom awaiting final judgment, with pale sunlight streaming through the frost-etched windows to illuminate the last act of their deadly drama. The telephone lines, restored with the storm's passing, had carried word to Exeter, and within the hour, the measured crunch of official motor cars announced the arrival of Inspector Hartwell and his constables. The inspector, a competent man whose deference to Poirot's reputation proved both genuine and practical, listened with growing amazement as the little Belgian detective provided his comprehensive report. The systematic presentation of evidence, from the hidden blueprint to the planted blood on Captain Blackwell's coat, painted a picture of criminal sophistication that impressed even the experienced officer. "Your methods are quite extraordinary, Monsieur Poirot," Inspector Hartwell observed as he examined the larding needle with professional interest. The psychological elements you've identified would have escaped conventional investigation entirely. Felix Dane's arrest proceeded with quiet dignity, the insurance investigator having abandoned all pretense following his confession. As the handcuffs clicked into place, he turned to Poirot with something approaching professional respect. "Your reputation is well-deserved, monsieur. I thought I had planned for every contingency, but I failed to account for the human elements that betrayed me." "The little grey cells. They are most observant of human nature," Poirot replied with characteristic precision. "Your technical knowledge was your strength in creating the fraud, but it became your weakness when applied to murder. A crime of passion might have gone undetected, but professional precision always leaves its signature. Miss Whitcomb's involvement proved more complex than simple complicity, her cooperation with the investigation and evident remorse warranting Inspector Hartwell's consideration of lenient treatment. The recovery of Dane's detailed records would require months of investigation across multiple jurisdictions, revealing a network of fraud that had corrupted galleries from London to New York. Lady Octavia, though maintaining her characteristic composure, showed the profound strain of witnessing such betrayal within her own home. As the official proceedings concluded and her guests prepared to depart, she approached Poirot with visible emotion. "Monsieur, how can I ever adequately express my gratitude? You have not merely solved a murder, but prevented the desecration of countless irreplaceable artifacts." Her voice carried the weight of one who understood the true scope of what had been prevented. "Madame," Poirot replied with gentle courtesy, "the satisfaction lies not in gratitude, but in the restoration of order. Truth, she is like a fine vintage. She improves with proper handling and reveals her full character only when the time is precisely right." The departures proceeded with the awkward formality of people who had shared an extraordinary experience that none would ever forget. Captain Blackwell, his innocence established and dignity restored, shook Poirot's hand with military precision. "Your methods are unlike anything taught at Sandhurst, but their effectiveness is undeniable." Dr. Pike's professional assessment proved equally complimentary. "Your psychological diagnosis was as precise as any medical examination. You rid guilt and innocence in symptoms I failed to recognize." Mrs. Gray's relief was palpable as she gathered her belongings. The terrible weight of suspicion finally lifted from her shoulders. Julian Lethbridge, his inheritance secure and reputation intact, managed his first genuine smile since the crisis began. As the last guest departed and the Candlelit Inn returned to its peaceful winter silence, Poirot remained for final consultation with Inspector Hartwell. The genuine Blackbrook chalice, recovered from a London safety deposit box along with damning records of the fraud network's operations, would be restored to its rightful place in the parish church, its ancient beauty unmarred by the violence that had briefly surrounded it. "The criminal mind, it fascinates me exceedingly," Poirot mused as he prepared for his own departure. Monsieur Dane possessed the intelligence and skill to achieve legitimate success, yet chose the path of deception. The psychology suggests a fundamental flaw in character that no amount of professional competence could overcome. The drive back to London proceeded through a landscape transformed by the retreating storm, snow-laden branches sparkling in the afternoon sunlight like nature's own masterpiece, unmarked by human deception. In his comfortable flat, surrounded by the familiar order of his books and artifacts, Hercule Poirot would record the case in his private journal with characteristic attention to detail. The entry would conclude with his customary observation: "The criminal mind seeks to impose its own order upon the world, but true order comes only from truth, and truth, she is patient but inexorable. The little grey cells, they never rest in her service." As evening settled over London, Poirot allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The affair at the Candlelit Inn had demonstrated once again that the most dangerous criminals often hide behind facades of respectability and professional competence, but that human nature, in all its complexity, inevitably betrays itself to those who observe with sufficient patience and precision. The Black Brook chalice would serve its sacred purpose for generations to come, while the Candlelit Inn would continue welcoming travelers, its ancient walls holding the memory of one extraordinary night when murder walked among the shadows and justice emerged with the methodical inevitability of dawn breaking over the English countryside.